Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the attendees online and to all the speakers to this panel. I hope this is the last panel fully online and that the next NER OECD and joint meeting with the Chair Governance and Regulation will be held in Paris and in person. So, but let's first thank the various panelists that have accepted to share their experience today about strategic foresight by regulators and sometimes by a broader set of players. It's obvious that this is one of the duty of any regulatory agency to have an understanding of the larger context in which they operate, but it's even more so in this context of rapid technological transformation and also economic transformation due to, of course, the digital transformation, due to the imperative of transformation of our large infrastructure and large service provision mechanisms to tackle with the climate change issue and more broadly to the ecologic issues and to the necessity of sustainable development. And so in this context, the OECD, among other organization and assembling of policymakers have insisted on the very central issue of being able to implement more agile regulatory governance. And in this context, it is essential to reduce the duration of the policy cycle, or to accelerate the policy cycle by developing a more effective and more rapid way of assessing the quality of regulation, assessing the failures of markets, industries, and regulation, and analyzing how regulatory objectives should be either revised or should be reached thanks to a revision of the tools that are implementing them. And in this context, of course, it is essential to develop strategic foresight to try to anticipate the next step. Thanks to their in-depth understanding of industries and operator strategies, thanks also to their tie with the various stakeholders of regulation, the regulators are well positioned to be involved in strategic foresight. Of course, they are not. Usually, they have no mandate for policy making, but at least they have a strong mandate for developing, for being efficient and effective in implementing policies, and basically a regulation is all about articulating public policies and economic efficiency, economic and social efficiency, I should say. Also, as we know, regulators are plays a central role in coordinating the various stakeholders in industries thanks to the so-called soft law tools. And in that context, the strategic foresight is also a potential a tool for providing the players in the industry with some focal points, with at least a basis for discussing among each other when major systemic change have to be considered. And so this is why this is particularly important today to hold this panel, to benefit from the experience of various regulators in different industry and national context. Today we will start by a short presentation of Miguel Amaral from the OECD, who is a senior policy analyst at the Regulatory Policy Division of the Public Governance Directorate. And Miguel has been one of the important actor in the definition of policy recommendation in terms of agile regulatory governance. So this Miguel will provide us with a broad picture, and then we will go into more details with the experience of various regulators and various bodies in different countries, as I announced before. I will announce each of them introduce each of them before they will speak, but we'll just to give you an idea of the program. We'll then have Sandro Mendonça for Portugal, Bacache from France, from ARCEP, Susanna Metsälampi from Finland, Dominique Jamme from France, from the CRE, from the energy regulator, and we'll last but not least we'll have Samuel Omolade from the UK, and of course we will manage to convey them question and to initiate some discussion among the panelists during this meeting. For those who are online and who are not panelists, you are able to ask a question in the little box. It's not the chat. It's in the question box. So you can raise question, and I will convey your question and summarize and synthesize your question if several questions are going in the same direction during the meeting. So again, I would like to thank all the panelists for their presentation. I want also to introduce and thank in advance Marta Baxter from the OECD, who will have the difficult task to conclude this meeting. So Marta, good luck, and thank you very much for having contributed to the organization of this event with your team. And so let's start. And Miguel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Eric. So the idea is to present a little bit the key ideas laid down in the recent OECD recommendation on agile regulatory governance for innovation that has been adopted back in October 2020. So basically, a key objective of the recommendation is really to help policymakers rethink policymaking and regulation in the fourth industrial revolution, and to kind of help them, realize the benefits and of innovation, and at the same time addressing the main adverse effects or the main risks. So the recommendation basically is organized around four main pillars. The first one is on the need to adjust regulatory management practices, so regulatory impact assessment, stakeholder engagement, and ex-post evaluation. And there is three main ideas within that first pillar. One is to develop a constant monitoring and ex-post evaluation of existing regulations. So that's kind of really the cornerstone of the policy making as seen by the recommendation. Second, the recommendation is pointing to the need for regulatory impact assessment approaches to be far more much flexible, adaptive, and in close combination with, you know, the result of the ex-post evaluations outcomes. So that for the two first ideas under that first pillar. The third one is really on, you know, rethinking stakeholder engagements and really to foster trust and legitimacy and the effectiveness, of course, of the rulemaking across, you know, each stage of the policymaking process. So in other words, there is really a need to think about stakeholder engagement as an ongoing process across the policymaking, from the design to the evaluation of regulation, rather than just a simple one-off exercise that you do when you think about, you know, developing a new regulation. So that's really a key idea within that first pillar of the recommendation. The second pillar is on the need to foster cooperation and joint-up approaches, including across jurisdictions. So it's quite clear, and there is no debate on this, that, well, innovation and digital innovation, but not only digital innovation, are really cutting across administrative and sectoral boundaries. And for that reason, there is really a need to develop a whole of government approach to rulemaking, again, from the design to the enforcement of regulation. So rethinking the mandate of existing regulators and fostering cooperation between the different government agencies or economic regulator. And second, within that same pillar, the recommendation is really putting forward the need for international regulatory cooperation, given the transboundary nature of innovation. It's quite clear that most of digital technology, well, they do not respect the national boundaries, so they really cut across a number of jurisdictions, basically, and it raises a number of problems. So in the face of this transboundary challenge, there's really the need to make the most of all the different approaches available to governments when it comes to fostering international cooperation. So it can be bilateral cooperation, regional cooperation, and even multilateral cooperation, basically. Really to foster mutual learning as regards what is going on for specific technological developments, to, as far as possible and where relevant, to try to improve the coherence across a different regulatory regime across countries. And also, again, where relevant is not always relevant, but try to think about, you know, joint-up approaches to regulation, to try to find a common way to regulate a technological development that's going to be common across countries. So that's for really the second pillar, which is really an important one within the recommendation. The third pillar is on the need to develop more the so-called agile approaches to regulation. So there is a couple of ideas within the recommendation. One being on, you know, the strong need to create more space for experimentation for two main reasons. One is to, we should not forget about that one. One is to, you know, foster policy learning on what are, you know, the risks and the opportunities of specific technological developments. And second, to create also incentives for innovators to develop innovation and to be able to benefit from some kind of regulatory exemptions, for example, to be able to develop a new technological innovation. So that's for one of the key ideas within that pillar on agile regulation. Another idea, which is exactly the topic of the discussion today, is on really on the need to anticipate much more by means of horizon scanning, scenario planning, but also with an earlier and more active engagement with stakeholders, you know, because, and in particular with the businesses, basically, and which is not always done. And the fact is that, well, businesses might be aware well before you know, government on what's going on and what are the risks and the opportunities that are raised by specific technological development. So really, that's strong need to build on the intelligence and the expertise of all interested stakeholders when you develop the foresight policy, I mean, as regards innovation. The third idea within the recommendation is on the need to better harness the soft law approaches to regulation, meaning self-regulation, for example, or co-regulation, or the industry standards, or even, you know, the ethical business regulation. This could be really interesting tools, either alone or as a complement to, you know, existing regulatory approaches already. So you might, for example, you know, provide some guidance as you develop, you know, an outcome-based approach to regulation to reduce a little bit the uncertainty. So really think about, you know, given the flexibility and the adaptability of soft law approaches, there is that need for government to think about this option when considering, you know, regulatory interventions in markets. And last but not least, the recommendation is clearly insisting on the need to think about, you know, the value of outcome-based approaches within regulation. Of course, we need to be realistic here. It's completely unrealistic to think about a regulation that is purely outcome-focused. It's not at all possible, you know. So it will always be a combination between outcome-based provisions and rule-based provision. But as far as this is relevant, basically, this is really an interesting tool in the face of the pacing problem, in the face of the, you know, the pace of technology, given the uncertainty. It's completely technology neutral, basically. So it's kind of an interesting tool also to trigger incentives for businesses, and to trigger also incentives to find ways to develop a product in the most cost-effective way, basically. So really, again, we think that there is a lot of value to be expected from the implementation of more outcome-focused approaches to regulation. So that's for the third pillar. The last one, and I must say that this is kind of the unloved part in most cases within government. So governments are really keen to design laws and regulation, but invest a little less in, you know, the regulatory delivery side of regulation. Although this is really extremely important to make sure that the regulation is delivering the expected outcome. So, and we also feel like in the face of the different challenges raised by innovation, there is that need to kind of rethink the traditional approaches to the enforcement along two main avenues. One is to really move towards, I mean, on a concrete basis, towards a more risk-based approaches to regulation. So adapt the enforcement strategy to the risks raised by specific use of technology. That's absolutely key. And second, and it has been the topic of a couple of webinars within the OECD, but also by the Club des Regulators, on the use of new digital technologies to improve regulatory enforcement, regulatory delivery. So I don't have time to elaborate a lot on that, but really digital technologies are providing a lot of opportunities to streamline enforcement activities, to reduce compliance costs, and this is really good given the challenges raised by the new technological development. So, as you might feel, this is really an ambitious recommendation, basically. So the idea going forward for the OECD is really to move towards the implementation of the recommendation. So we will really help governments to implement the different provisions laid down in the recommendation, basically across the different pillars. But I just wanted to conclude, to make a couple of remarks here. Well, everyone is talking about, agile approaches to regulation. That's a new sexy, trendy term, basically. But we also wanted to say within the recommendation that none of the agile approaches to regulation is optimal per se, is a magical solution, certainly not, basically. In most cases, every single so-called soft law approaches to regulation has a number of potential flaws. If you think, as I said, well, the uncertainty that might be created by an outcome-based regime. For example, if you think at all the competition concerns that might be associated with the regulatory sandbox, for example, or the fact that self-regulation, might not work if the interests of the state, the government, and the industry are not aligned to a sufficient degree, basically. So clearly, there is really a need to build expertise before thinking about implementing an agile approaches to regulation. Second key idea I wanted to underline here is on the fact that all the different approaches need to be implemented in a dynamic perspective, to keep pace with the technological changes. So regulatory sandboxes, the famous regulatory sandboxes, might be well suited at the early stage of the technological development. But then as the technology develops, it might be a need to move towards other approaches. So this is something to think about as you develop the regulatory impact assessment, to get away from that idea that regulation is necessarily static. It is in a number of cases, but it don't need to be a forever set in stone. And so this is really an incentive for government to think proactively on my regulatory response in a dynamic perspective. Last but not least, the recommendation you'll see is putting forward a number of key preconditions for the implementation of the recommendation. And one is really to build capacity within governments to understand basically the regulatory gaps and challenges, to design the appropriate regulatory or non-regulatory response, building on a broad stakeholder engagement to really to capitalize on the expertise, and at the same time to build trust, which is a problem in our societies nowadays. Capacity is key also, and we have done a lot of different studies on that to enforce the regulation, to change a little bit the culture in terms of the standard regulatory delivery strategies that do not work in a number of cases. And capacity is needed also to really to monitor the existing regulation, to assess their effectiveness in a almost in a continuous way. So in that perspective, well, we feel like there is two main levers. One is to reskill the workforce when needed, and second is to kind of rethink the existing governance frameworks and adapt where relevant the mandates and powers of regulatory agencies. That's it for me. Hopefully I've not been too long, but I'm giving the floor back to Eric. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, Miguel. You have been perfectly on time. You are perfectly on time. So thank you so much. And so thank you for this introduction that basically reminded us the broader context in which those exercises of strategic forecasting is essential. As you mentioned, I think this is central to consider also the international cooperation context. Typically, forecasting is essential to share some vision, both with the industry, but also in the international context among regulators. And also in the international context, it's so clear that self-regulation and ethical principles have a strong role because of the difficulty of settling totally comprehensive regulatory framework. This is essential also to share the vision and to identify at least the opportunities and the risk carried by the evolution both of the technology and of the business practices. So thank you so much, Miguel. And so now we will switch to Sandro Mendonça, who is member of the board of directors of the Portuguese Communication Authority, ANACOM, sorry. And so, Sandro, the floor is yours to share with us your practice and your experience in practicing regulatory forecasting. Thank you very much.
Merci, Eric. So, thank you, everybody. Thank you to the Dauphine team. Thank you to the OECD team. I would like to commend this theme that we should develop more. And I would like to organize my contribution around two key ideas: the idea of anticipation and the idea of agility, which is already inscribed in the thought materials for this session. So anticipation, I would like to say it can be broken up into categories. So regulators could nurture forward-looking capabilities, invest in these sort of capabilities, and not only forward-looking, but sense-making, since we need not only forecasting, but nowcasting. And this connects with the issue of agility. So agility, I would break the concept into two categories as well, in which we have the whole idea of pre-adaptation, since when the future comes, it is really too late to be optimal facing it. So we need to build structures of a minimal kind that allow us to fastly evolve into the future. So pre-adaptation is a sort of attitude. The other attitude is strategic improvisation. And improvisation is not to be taken from the street slang in which we think it's ad hoc behavior in face of the unexpected, but more in the jazz language in which we have a given number of chords and we will play along as the stimuli come. So the whole conversation regarding regulation and foresight, I think it's really apt for today, as we see the environment to be punctuated with a number of extreme events that change things. So in 2020, we had the impact of the pandemics. In 2021, I take as a symbol the ship Evergrande to be stuck at the Suez Canal, disrupting global supply chains. And of course, in 2022, we have this situation of conflict in Europe, all right? So this, for me, is pointing out that, in fact, the 21st century started in the year 2020. And why do I say this? Because I take as reference the work of the historian Eric Hobsbawm. Along the lines of this historian, I hope you picked up on that, Eric Hobsbawm. He talked about
Yes.
the short 20th century, starting the First World War and ending with the breakup of the Soviet camp, right? Ever since, we have lived in some sort of moment, in-between moment, and perhaps we have started here a new moment. He referred to the 20th century as the century of extremes, and I talk about this century as the century of volatility. Yeah, and this is why we need to talk about foresight and regulation, because sectors collide like the digital sector and electronic communication sector in my own field here at ANACOM, or the sectors break up, like the infrastructure detaching from the telecoms operators. So we have these sectoral dynamics. We also have business model dynamics in which you have mutations in the offerings. So we need as regulators to do puzzle picturing. Since this is very difficult, the pieces of the puzzles are changing shape and the pattern of the picture is evolving. So this is very difficult to do at an analytical perspective. But in an organizational perspective, it's very difficult. I have been noticing that among regulators, we have difficulties in forward-looking projects. And I think that a platform like the OECD could be helpful here, since it unites this need for anticipation and agility. And things that we can do together sometimes will compensate for this foresight failure. So I think the OECD platform is a basis for us to tackle this foresight failure with common projects that will allow us to build the forward-looking capabilities, the sense-making capabilities, the pre-adaptation menus that we need to develop, and the improvisational capabilities. We need sensors of weak signals, and we need to understand what to do when there are wildcards, major discontinuities, and we can do these together. I can give you some examples at ANACOM of how we deal with radical uncertainty moving forward. And these are just illustrative of how we can actually have a proactive attitude towards uncertainty. So the first example could be from our 5G auction that ended last year. We fought hard to keep the window open for changes in the market structure in order to avoid lock-in. And this is something you can build in the rules of the auction to keep it open for new players, new entrants. And another example comes not from the specifically regulatory task, but from the supervision task. We have a big phenomena, which is the phenomenon of mega events, like the Football Champions League, which is very consuming of spectrum, or the Formula One event we had last year. And we deployed good resources to these mega events in order to be very close to the future. So many technologies that are used in the racetrack in Formula One with these connected cars, because they really are connected cars and they have a connected track full of sensors, to be close to these emergent technologies is very good for us, because it connects our staff with practices that are ahead of the market, so that when the market finally catches up, we are already there. We are already facilitating the future. Finally, the third example is when we are connecting with startups. And startups are very interesting because many startups are heavy users of spectrum. Startups are sometimes not very literate regarding spectrum usage regulations, and when we can transfer that knowledge to them. But in this activity, we also receive a lot because we see creativity in their ways to develop new services, and this is for us very interesting. So my point is that thank you. Foresight should be appropriated by us. Foresight is dealing with uncertainty. This means that we have to develop an appreciative attitude. I mean, it's a qualitative exercise. And funny enough, this is very complementary with data-driven approaches, which are very quantitative. So with these two legs, I think we can move forward into a new stage of regulatory strategy in many fields that are crossing their paths all the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandro. And first, I'd like to check with the panelists if any of them wants to react to the first two talks and wants to raise a question. So if so, please do not hesitate to open your micro and your camera. Otherwise, at this point, I don't see any question in the stream of questions. I have a question, in fact, for you. Maya, do you want to raise a question, or are you just preparing yourself for your talk? Okay, so I have a question for you, Sandro. As you mentioned in your conclusion, you mentioned that Foresight is really about dealing with uncertainty. It's a very qualitative process, but in the same time, you mentioned that it has to be combined with data-driven approach. So, could you tell us a bit more on how maybe data analytics is relied upon by the Portuguese authorities and especially by ANACOM to try to identify, for instance, weak signals or to identify new emerging trends? It would be very interesting, I think, for our audience if you have something to share on this.
Well, the first thing is that we know that we live in intellectual cycles. And one of the latest intellectual cycle, and we see these in Brussels, for instance, but elsewhere, is that data is the thing, right? Data is everything. And what I want to do is to contrast with these data-driven mindset, which I cherish, that I value. But I want to contrast this with extreme qualitative analytical attitudes as well. And this, I think, is important for us to become less dependent on data and have a more mindful attitude towards the limitations of our own knowledge base. So, sorry to be so conceptual, Eric, but I will transfer one specific idea, and some data are actually reporting stuff for you coming from the future, because some data are already bleeping stuff going on in the future. So take my own example. So in my civil life, before coming here, I dealt a lot with the economics of innovation, which is a field that I have devoted myself for a long time. And in these fields, we know that number one, foresight is a way to wire up the community of stakeholders, because we are coordinating our minds and compensating for individual blind spots. Yeah, so that's one thing. So foresight is actually a strategic conversation. Then, in the economics of technical change, you are also very, you have to be very humble regarding the nature of change. I mean, the rate and direction of technical change. And for that, you can use some indicators that are quite useful. And myself, I have used these indicators. And I connect this with ANACOM's work. So we are interested in drones as tools to manage spectrum, but we are interested in drones because they are heavy users of spectrum themselves, and we have drones being used a lot. And we had a mega project in September, which actually involved 17 countries. The armed forces came to Portugal from 17 countries to experiment with robotics. And drones that were unmanned aerial drones or surface drones or underwater drones, they were used. And we had to orchestrate the channels in which they would communicate. Yeah, and the drone phenomena is quite interesting because you can map out the trajectories of evolution of drones. And one way to do this is actually to use intellectual property of manufacturers regarding patents or even trademarks or designs, or even publications, scientific publications by the key manufacturers, to see how are they progressing in the way they are unfolding the expansive possibilities of drones. So they are, of course, using frequencies that are higher and higher in the radio spectrum. Yeah, you can predict this, or you can look at an antenna in a Formula One car. You talk with the engineers, as we did last year, and you know exactly what is the manufacturer of the antenna, and you can go to databases at the European Patent Office and check what are their latest patents. And a patent is ahead of the market because it is filed or granted typically before that product or equipment is introduced in the marketplace. Mm-hmm. So before it lands for commercial purposes, you can already pre-adapt, you see, your spectrum supervision routines and get equipped with more appropriate instrumentation so that you can monitor the usage of these stuff when it comes to the market. Yeah, so this is one example, and of course I am connecting my own professional research trajectory with these demands, sometimes very stringent, to be rigorous, but to be adaptive regarding what are you regulating. So the way you yourself are able to be an innovative regulator, and you are not shy about, well, sometimes you have to regulate innovation itself. Anyway, it's like a dance, yeah, between you and the change phenomena out there.
Thank you very much, Sandro. And now I will give the floor to Maya Bacache, who is a member of the College of Commissioner of the French Electronic Communication Regulatory Authority. I should say Electronic Communication and Post and Press Regulatory Authority, the ARCEP in France. Maya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eric, and thank you for organizing this this debate. Thanks also to the OECD for the report and the introduction. I'll first be very brief in my introduction, but I'd like to just comment on why do we need agile regulator and how do we manage agile regulation. And then I'll focus a bit longer on two examples. Let's say first a positive example and maybe second a less positive one, just to discuss about the challenges and the difficulties, the problems we could have when you want to be agile. So do you see my slides? I'm not sure that you do see my slides. Yes, there. Okay. So why and how? Actually, in the mandate of ARCEP, we include innovation as a purpose. So we are very cautious about our regulation not diminishing the path and the rhythm of innovation in the telecommunication sector. So innovation is really one of our purpose, and it helps us make an effective and efficient regulation. So we do have a pro-innovation prism. And we, of course, like all of us, we try to be forward-looking. But the problem is how do we implement this forward-looking approach? So what are our methods? We don't have prospective analysis per se. We do not make prospective analysis per se. So how do we manage to be forward-looking and to make strategic foresight? Basically by, of course, being open to the ecosystem of researchers, operators, etc., that help us imagine what the future could be and imagine what, especially the uses, what is usage of telecommunication will be in the future. And as examples, I mentioned in the slide, we made many notes on AI, on the development of agriculture and telecommunication, and I'd like to develop just two points. First, one about platform, and the second about environment. By being a bit forward-looking, I think we succeeded in including environment in our regulatory decisions, and we were one of the first independent authority to do so, and not to exclude environment and say, okay, it's someone else's problem. It was really a major issue for us to include environment in our regulation, and I think our forward-looking approach helped us see that it was an important topic, of course, as you all know. So being open to the whole ecosystem, but of course, to react on what was said just before, we do qualitative analysis to make strategic forecast. We make consultations, and we have a regulatory sandbox, as it was mentioned before by the OECD. But I'd like to develop one maybe specificity of ARCEP. ARCEP developed very early what now is called data-driven regulation. So I'll show. I don't think you can see exactly what is on the slide, but just to give you a general idea, we do use data not only to give information to consumers, not only to have information from consumers, but really to empower consumers. That is, to make them make the efficient decision and to give them incentive to choose the best operator for them. And doing so, it helps the whole market being more efficient because it gives signals and incentives to telecommunication operators to, make a better coverage or increase the quality of their services and so on. So the regulating with data is not a theoretical thing. It's not a nice thing to communicate on. It's really part of our regulation and a major tool that helps us make strategic foresight. And I could give you many examples how those tools helped us in the past to see, to have weak signals of what would come major problems. So it helps us anticipate and solve the problems before maybe they become like major issues. So I hope this is clear. I could, of course, develop later on the methods if you like. But I would like to give you, to tell you the stories, actually, of two specific regulations and to show you how we try to adapt and to be agile. And sometimes we succeeded and maybe sometimes we could succeed more or better. So the first example I'd like to develop is about 5G. So as you know, I think it's a major innovation in the telecommunications sector. And what we do at ARCEP is we allocate the rare resource, the frequencies. And in order to allocate the resource to the one who need the resource more, we need to assess demand, of course. We need to know who needs the resource. And in 2017, well, actually, no one needed the resource in a way. And at that time, we knew it was a major innovation. It was a major technical innovation. But the issue was, okay, who will use it better? Who will be the most efficient to use it? And so to whom should we allocate the resource and how should we allocate it? So ARCEP made a large consultation in France, and it appeared at that time that there was no real industrial demand. The firms at that time were like just observing this new innovation and saying, okay, what for? Is there a need? It's maybe too costly, it will be difficult to implement. So we didn't feel there was a real industrial demand at that time. So what did we do? We of course, after this consultation, we opened experimental portal to allocate frequencies, and we decided to allocate those part of those frequencies, the core frequencies of 3.5 that allowed the best 5G and at least what was decided on the European level. So we decided to attribute those frequencies to the telecom operators, but who were willing to develop the services on those frequencies. And we were expecting that the industrial demand would appear at a point in time. So when attributing those frequencies to the telecom operators, we included obligations for them to answer to the industrial demand, either by providing the service directly or by providing the frequencies to the industrial firms, to the sector directly by giving the frequencies directly so that they could develop a private network and not a public network. Okay, so I hope it's clear. So that's what happened in 2019. We attributed those frequencies to the telecom operators through an auction process. And then the industrial demand began. Of course, it began in Germany, in Korea, in the US, and it began also in France. So we were happy to see that firms were implementing experimentations, but also real strategic thinking, and sometimes transformation, digital transformation of their firms. So to match with this developing demand, we opened a new portal for frequencies around the 3.8, just close to the historical one, to adapt and to answer this new emerging demand. And yet to come, there is a new portal, new frequencies. A new portal for frequencies on the 26th portal that is already open for experimental approaches, but that will open very soon. So it was maybe a bit technical. I hope it was clear enough, but just to show you how, even if you know that the demand is here, yet if it's not here, as a regulator, you have to anticipate and you have to allocate the frequencies, but keeping an agile approach to be able to adapt and to give more or to give less, and to create obligations for those who have already proceeded to adapt to the market. So I could develop more, but I just wanted to give you this example because I think it shows how difficult it is to be agile, to have a strategic foresight, but that we have tools to do so. And I hope the future will show that industries will be able to implement 5G in efficient conditions. The second example is not a so positive story as the first one, and I wanted to also share that with you because it shows how difficult it is to make foresight and to keep agile. But I think we managed to do so. So the second example is about the DTT, the Digital Terrestrial Televisions, TNT in French. So in 2018, ARCEP made a study, and that study showed that actually consumers would use more, let's say, broadcasting systems to access TV, and that the share of TV viewing methods through DTT were really steadily decreasing. And we expected the share of DTT to be smaller and smaller, and maybe at the end to collapse. So at that time, ARCEP thought that competition was dynamic enough between different broadcasting systems, and maybe that regulation was no more needed in that sector, again, because of what we expected about what consumers would do in the near future. What happened is that in 2019, ARCEP extended regulation of this wholesale terrestrial broadcasting market for just 2 years, just the idea that we could accompany the market and progressively reduce regulatory constraints. But actually, the ecosystem proved us wrong. The consumers continued to use DTT to access TV for many reasons. First, because DTT is free, and second is that it depends on your age, on your generation, and third, that in many households you had 2 or 3 TVs, and one would be connected to the broadband line, but the others would only have DTT. So we didn't see a collapse as expected. And in 2021, this year, we made a new consultation, and the ecosystem gave us the idea that they needed regulation still, because of the important share of the major operator, which was TDF, major terrestrial broadcaster. So we renewed our regulation, and this regulation was a bit different from the past, of course, because mainly based on commitments from TDF, this prominent operator, and the commitments were submitted to the authority, of course, regarding the next regulatory period. So yes, I hope the second example shows also how forecast could prove wrong, and how it's also important to adapt again and again. To conclude, maybe if I still have 2 minutes, challenges are very important in the near future. I'd like to ask this question maybe to all the panelists and even to our colleagues that who are listening to us today. I don't have the answer to this question, so maybe we could discuss it. Of course, we need to be agile. Of course. Again, why? Because we regulate very innovative sectors, and if we don't adapt, if you don't make strategic foresight, regulation will be inefficient and will limit innovation and eventually growth and well-being. So I think for me it's obvious that we need to be agile. However, how to be agile without being discretionary in a way? Because we still need to have a stable regulation. We still need the firms to have stable expectations on what we are doing and what we are implementing. So I'd like to finish on that, on the trade-off we need to make between agility and stability. And one example of that is the fact that in France we are moving from the copper infrastructure to the fiber one. And Orange, our main telecommunication operator, announced that it will close the copper infrastructure. So, of course, being agile to adapt to this major disruption, to the major transition, but how to be at the same time cautious to protect consumers during this transition. So, yes, I'll finish on this open question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Maya. This is a kind of regular challenge that the regulator are facing, ensuring stability and foreseeability for the players and for the consumers, and in the same time welcoming and hosting innovation. So that's a central issue there. Let me now introduce Susanna Metsälampi from the Transport System Service and Communication Agency, Traficom, from Finland, where she's the leading legal advisor. And Susanna will share with us also her experience and the experience of her agency with agile regulation. So Susanna, the floor is yours.
Bonjour tout le monde. Hello everyone. Good evening. Good afternoon rather. In Finland we are 1 hour ahead, but we're still not in the evening. It's I want to thank Club des Regulators as well as OECD for arranging this panel discussion. Already it has been very interesting. I've really enjoyed listening to my co-panelists and their thoughts on the issue. If I just may present myself in just a couple of words so that you will better understand where I come from. I'm representing the Transport and Communications Agency in Finland. So we are a truly multi-sectoral agency. We are, first of all regulator for all modes of transport, road, rail, sea, and air. And we are also the agency for telecommunications sector as well as postal matters. And we also house the Cybersecurity Center for Finland. So working in Traficom has given me the opportunity to have a very good outlook on several sectors and to have a better understanding of how things are working in different sectors. I have my background in aviation. I started 30 years ago as a civil servant for aviation matters. And I started very soon in my career to participate in rulemaking activities, both on national level, preparing for national legislation and agency regulations, but also on the international forum. So mostly with the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, but also within the European Union, so mostly on aviation issues. But so I've been looking at rulemaking on many levels, and I think it's a really fascinating area. So I'm very happy to share with you some thoughts on agile rulemaking that I've picked on during my years as a civil servant. I wanted to start my presentation with some thoughts on the role of the rulemaker, because we were talking about foresight, having foresight, and being agile and trying to forecast and nowcast. I really liked this word, this concept, but I wanted to underline. To me, if we are looking at the rulemaker, I looking from the industry point of view, I think that it is, to me, it's absolutely clear that the rulemaker should not have a leading role. It should have a definitely a supportive role, but I don't think that the rulemaker should be the one who really leads the industry where it is going. I had a boss at a certain time who said that if we know what is best for the industry, or if one of us civil servants know what is best for the industry, we should move on the side of the industry and let them be the innovators and the vehicles for progressing the market and the industry. But we need to be there to support them, to give them the support, and also to have the to have the safeguards put in place. So and of course, as it was said already in the presentation, in the invitation to this panel discussion, it's been obvious that the role of the rulemaker has been to react to problems, to challenges, to be able to embrace new innovations, etc. But also we have the need to react to trends. We have the obligation, our society expects us to react to political agendas, and more lately we are expected to react even to the weakest signals. And this is something that my colleagues, co-panelists, have been speaking of already in the beginning, and I'll be saying a bit more on the weak signals in a minute. But I see that we know that agile regulations, we have new challenges, we have new ideas on how to carry out our work, but we can't abandon also the traditional need for the regulator really to tackle on true challenges and disruptions and so in fact our competencies need to be very wide. We need to have a very open eye on what is going on at the moment. And also when we are thinking of the role of the rulemaker, I feel very much that we are answering to expectations. And these expectations can vary a lot. The industry expects us to guarantee a level playing field so that no competitor is better off than the other. And here we are again in the question of technology neutrality and having neutral rules. Then we have the political side, and consumers are trusting on us to safeguard security. Then it has been already for some years, it has been a self-evident expectation that the rulemaker takes into account every aspect of climate change. How can we make sure that we don't that we take into account climate change in all that we do? Then, of course, one of the expectations in all our doing is to safeguard consumer protection, to look at the interests of the consumers. And then another issue, yet again, data protection, which is a facet of consumer protection to me, but that's another thing to consider. And then there is the issue that we are mostly talking when we are talking about agile rulemaking. It's allowing for innovation, digitalization, automation. I was working a little over 5 years ago. I was working for the ministry in Finland in a larger legislative project where we rewrote pretty much of the transport legislation in Finland. And there, one of the drivers for the whole project, for the political decision makers, was that we should make sure that legislation does not stay in the way of innovation, digitalization, automation. This message is not perhaps no longer written in government programs, but I think that it is also a self-evidence in today's society. We need to take into account all these aspects. And I think that the expectations and the role of the rulemaker it's very important to understand this, that we can't just think about agile rulemaking. We need to remind ourselves that we still have also the traditional sides to take into account in our activities. Just a few words about weak signals, where to look for input. Where do we find, as regulators, the weak signals? And also, how do we work together? How do we best take into account the work that is being done within the industry, so that we are really working side by side with the industry to develop the industry and the rulemaking connected to it? Well, at least on the transport sector, the emergence of the requirements on management systems and quality systems has happened already in the last decades. So it's not a total new concept, but it is progressing. It's getting more and more clear that both in the rulemaking and in also in the industry itself, the organizations, they want to develop their method of carrying out business through management systems and quality systems. And these systems have introduced a more organized way in assessing the sustainability and resilience of the activities, and really recognizing the risks. For the industry, it is very important that they make sure that they can carry out their activities also if there are some disruptions in their operations. These disruptions can be of many nature. There may be a nature catastrophe, or there may be a strike, or there may be anything. There may be a pandemic that really disrupts their normal way of carrying out business. So they have developed management systems or quality systems, or both, to see on how they are functioning, what is essential, what are the risks to an undisrupted operation, and how can they mitigate the risks. And to me, these systems and the risk assessments and the mitigation measures are a very good source of information to the regulator that is performing the oversight of these organizations, to look at what is going on, how the industry, the service providers, how they see their future, what do they recognize as the major risks, and what alternatives they see in mitigating these risks. And then it is up to us as regulators to make sure that they can best benefit from the mitigation measures they have recognized. Or then we can look at the risks that they have recognized and consider whether there is something that we as authorities, as regulators, can do with those risks. A second source of information, when we are talking about data-driven regulation, to me is information we receive from individuals working in the industry. And more particularly here, I'm thinking about the new emerging whistleblowing rules, but also which can be also known as occurrence reporting systems, if we're talking aviation. But whistleblowing, I think, is more known through horizontally through various industries. So this is a case where we establish reporting systems whereby individuals can report to the authorities when they recognize incidents where rules have been, where there has been an infringement of rules or some other disruption, something unusual has happened that has created or could have created problems. And to those systems providing for disidentification of the informant allows the authorities, the regulator, to receive a lot of information. Small drops of information become a large flow. And with large amount of information, we can really talk about data-driven regulation, can't we? As an example, I'm more familiar with the aviation occurrence reporting systems. In aviation, in the European system, you are expected to report every safety-related occurrence happening, an incident that has endangered or could have endangered safety. And when we are talking about amount of information, I can say that Finland is quite a small country. We are 5.5 million people. We have one major airport. We have one big airline, and the rest, well, we are quite small players in the aviation arena otherwise. But within this small country, we get from the industry within 1 year 10,000 occurrence reports, 10,000 in this small industry. And this is where I say that where do we look for weak signals? They are small individual data sets, and together they give us a lot of information. What are the weaknesses? What are the trends? What incidents keep occurring? What do they tell about the level of training? What do they tell about the level of systems? What do they tell about the management of the organizations themselves? This is, I think, a very good source of information, for example. And also, I've had the pleasure. I've been fortunate enough to have been working in agencies where we have really been able to familiarize ourselves with different sectors, although specializing in mostly one, but you have had the outlook in other sectors. And I think that is also very important when we are looking for weak signals, let's not look straight just in our own sector, but let's get out of our silos and look within the other sectors, because we know that that progress and innovation often they are recognized in one sector. They develop that for their purposes, and suddenly it is recognized that the same issues or the same innovation can be used in a similar or perhaps in a little different way in another sector. So it is very important for us also to keep our eyes open and look on across the border of our own sector. And so my last slide is then for some ideas of what kind of tools we can then, what kind of guidance should we use when we have gathered all this data and we want to do agile tools. So I think it was first, it was in the beginning, it was also already mentioned that we have been speaking about outcome-based standards. There may be performance-based standard, goal-based standards or rules. It has many names, but I think that when we are thinking of how do we write the rules, we should keep in mind the idea that focusing on measurable performance and output objectives is a good way to allow for innovation and progress in the details of how to provide goods and services and how to regulate the provision of goods and services. So I think that I think that the concept of outcome-based regulation tends to be a bit, well, we've been speaking about it already for some time, but I think that it's something that should not be forgotten, and it's very useful. I just, for example, I added a link to the website of the International Maritime Organization speaking of goal-based standards. So it's something that is very much practiced also today. A second toolkit, a second means for guaranteeing or for creating rules that are agile and that are perhaps more endurable is also building on standards where available. Here I would say that I added links on a couple of new regulations. These are European Union regulations, which in fact are basing the rules and the requirements on existing standards or standards to be developed. I think that is a very good way of writing rules. Yet we have to remember that if the standards have to be developed really democratically, and not just that we apply the standards of the biggest company, because we need to have the new incumbents in the market, the new small companies need also be able to participate in the development of the standards. And then a third means to allow for agile rule making is to write rules so that they include the possibility for alternative ways to implement the rule, or they allow for exemptions in order to test new ideas, including, but they need to include, in that case, safeguards to protect safety, consumer interests, and all those expectations that I was speaking of in the beginning. I have added some links, so if you're interested, so later you can go and look what what I was particularly referring to when writing those slides. I don't know how well I'm with my time, but I think that I could resume here, and I'm ready to to answer any questions or participate in the discussion later on. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Susanna, and thank you both Susanna and Maya for having insisting on the fact that strategic foresight comes in the context of the daily operation, let's say, of regulatory authorities, and then it raises the issue of the dialogue that is organized between the regulatory authorities and the operators in the industry. And there is a question that was raised by Assunta Luiso Perotti in the discussion that basically point out the tension between the engagement of regulators with the operators and often the incumbent operators, and the issue of independence. So, do you have any thought about this, Susanna or Maya, of course, but and other panelists, of course. Susanna,
I raised my hand. Yes, I saw the question. That is a very good question, and I think that is the spot where we regulators need to be very transparent. So when we engage with the industry in discussions, the discussion should be open to all. So we should, on our website, where we invite people to have comments, so we need to make it very clear that we reach out to everyone and not just talking to the big players in the market. So that is very, very important, and it was a very good question. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Maya.
Yes, I concur, of course, but I do feel it's very difficult because, for instance, in my sector, it's easier to speak with telecom operators because they have manpower. You know, they have people whose job is to speak to the regulator. Whereas when you want to speak to consumers associations, for instance, it's more difficult. They have less time. There are fewer people. It's so on. So we need to be very, very cautious. Not when we speak, because we need to speak to all of them. But yes, I do concur that we need to be very cautious about the plurality, about the diversity of the people we speak to, and. Maybe say again what Jean Tirole used to say about the capture of regulator. Sometimes we need to change the regulator and the people regulating because of that risk of being captured by the ecosystem. It's not about corruption. It's not about being paid by the private firm. It's about having our mind framed in a certain way. So yes, it's absolutely a major issue, and it's an everyday battle to be open to other mind frame.
Yeah, I think, Maya, you also mentioned an important issue there, which is basically the relationship with the, let's say, the academic community, because the academic community, of course, is cooperating with the industry, but let's say on a wider basis, and there are less, direct interest involved, even if, of course, some academics might be influenced also by the mindset, let's say, to say the least, of regulated firms.
Absolutely, it's crucial to work with the researchers and the academics on our topics, because even if the mindset is influenced, they surely have a more open-minded than people really engaged in the ecosystem. Yeah, I do believe that.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. So since we are running not out of time, but straight on time, I think it's time to switch to the next speaker. And the next speaker is Dominique Jamme, who is the managing director of the Energy Regulator Commission in France, the CRE. And Dominique is also the current president of the Club des Régulateurs. And so one of the characteristic of the core, and also we'll see of the Regulatory Horizon Council in the UK, is that both institutions, organizations have been really directly involved in the production of Foresight, and as we all know, the future of electric system in the case of Dominique is rather uncertain, because there are many options and there are also many crises ongoing. So it's difficult to adapt to all those potential changes. So Dominique, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Eric, and congratulations for this very, very interesting meeting, I would say. Well, a few preparatory remarks, introductory remarks, if you allow me. First one, on the last point, I fully concur with what Maya just said. It's very easy for us to engage with the industry. It's very difficult to engage with consumer association and consumers in general, except industrial consumers. And we have to be very careful. I find myself very, very frequently remaining to my president, my commissioners, even my directors. Well, just remind you just talk a lot with the industry and very little with consumer. So in the end, we as regulator, we are very, very, very often, we are the defender and the representative of consumers. Otherwise, there are nowhere in the decision process. So I fully concur. It's a difficult thing. But anyway, if you are conscious of that, I think you can do it. Another thing I just noted on what was said is what Sandro said about improvisation, which you shouldn't do if you would enough strategic foresight. But in the end, and especially last years, we had to, because we had the COVID crisis, first of all, and well, in our sector, well, from one day to the other, then you have a huge drop in demand, which at least physically is difficult to manage, but on market prices really collapsed for gas and electricity. So some kind of improvisation. Then you had 2020, then you had 2021, it was the contrary, strong economic growth, so strong increases in prices. Obviously, the consumers and a lot of people in society just asking, well, what are those increases? So we had to do some improvisation, but in the end, I would say, and I'm sure Annegret will agree, because she sees that at the European level, because she's the head of the Association of European Regulators, that basically we just keep saying, well, markets are giving the right signals, they are functioning, so we can adapt such little here and there, but we can continue to have the market. So we had a improvisation, but with the kind of stability which was needed. And then you have the present situation, where especially for energy, well, you all know, we all see, we've seen this weekend, then the war crimes worsening and worsening on a huge scale. So it's getting worse and worse by the day. And regarding energy, huge consequences, because as you know, all know, gas is coming a lot from Russia. But more of that, the last few months, and even before the war, the issue with our gas market is that maybe we could say that it's kind of broken, because one of the basic principles that is based on is that you have enough competition on supply side and demand side. And then we have seen, especially the last months of 2021, we can deal with dominant position, which can be the case of Gazprom. And we deal with that, especially in France with electricity, we can deal with that. But what is special is that when you have one dominant player just not behaving anymore as a pure commercial actor, which was the case of Gazprom, what we saw. So we are now in the process of, at French level, but especially at European level, being in a kind of improvisation, because we know that any day, and with a very short notice, we could have a huge change in the functioning of the market with some kind of interruption or reduction of gas coming from Russia. So the present situation is very, very difficult. What is very, very special is that underlying technological trends are the same as they were before, especially technological trends. We should still have solar, wind, batteries being technologies of the future. But at the same time, we have a huge change, probably long term, with maybe no more Russian gas or less and less gas. And well, that's very special for us, and we have to deal with that. On this topic also, we have I hear what Maya said, which was very, very important, which is agile but stable, and that's very important for us regulators, because in energy, but I think as is other transportation, telecom sectors, communication sectors, we are what kind of capital intensive industries. In energy, when you build some network assets, they have a 50 years in France lifespan, and so well, it's the same for production, especially nuclear production, etc., etc. Even if other assets, if more 20 years, but even 20 years, it's very, very long. So you need stability for investors, and so this is, everybody know that. I think every regulator in Europe is trying to be kind of stable and predictive for especially investors, especially in networks. And then you have, sure, you have listened to that with the crisis. You have Belgium just saying, I think last week or a few days ago, they will postpone the exit from nuclear production by 10 years, following the gas crisis. And so, well, this have consequences. For instance, ENGIE, which is the industrial in charge of nuclear production in Belgium, they have a huge strategy, global strategy saying no more nuclear 2025, and then they have to adapt to that and to change their strategy. Also, other producers, a lot of obviously gas power plants were in the process of being built in order to replace the nuclear. Then, question is, will we be needed in the next 10 years? So this question of visibility and stability is also very, very important. So that was a big kind of that context, which is obviously very, very special at the moment. So if I go back to strategic foresight, a few words. I try to go to the next slide, if it works. You have the second slide? This, okay, this is it. Good. So just, I'm sure you know that, but in the energy sector, what do we do? First of all, we ensure the performance of infrastructure operators, network operators, cost control, quality of service, which means incentive regulation. Obviously, it's not only cost control, it's just to incentivize them to be efficient, investment, innovation, and so on. We regulate markets, especially trying to foster competition, innovation, and also monitoring and surveying the markets, because may have bad behavior sometimes, obviously. And third one, supporting the energy transition, given that the policy for energy transition is the government policy. So we are just supporting for the implementation on this one. So, well, this one will be very, very quick. I just said it. Energy sector is a long-term investment sector, but at the same time undergoing profound and rapid transformation, because obviously we must adapt to the new goals of carbon neutrality and energy transition. So we need to anticipate major trends. What's very important is that we look at the future, but we are not doing some very technical work regarding scenarios, regarding modelization of the future of the energy sector or electricity or gas sector. This is the work of RTE, which is our TSO, and managing the energy system. You also have the ADEME in France. You have a lot of people doing scenarios. So we don't do that. We don't do modelization. We have no money either, and no I would say, competency to do that. So well, a few years back, it may look getting older and older, but I think it's still interesting, and it's interesting because I was the person in charge of that. So I have just that in my mind, and I can also say that being in an organization in charge, an organizer in charge of the Foresight committee and the Foresight thinking is not something bad regarding your career, because now I'm managing director. So I think it's worth noting. So 2017, first of all, it was a new president of CRE, but second one, I would say, there was no sense of urgency, no sense of the transformation of the energy sector in the whole French society, I would say, press, general people, but also in the government, and even within CRE. I would say general sense of continuity, especially in France. We have a lot of nuclear power. It had been good for the last 20 years. So everybody was in the process of, well, let's continue, and then we will progressively develop some renewables, but no urgency at all. And so we had this vision by our president to just go and look at the future really, because some people inside CRE were seeing that a lot of change were happening everywhere in the world. And so we just couldn't in France just say, oh, nothing happening. And so we launched this, what was a really strategic study with an external consultant. And while we worked a lot on, with this very good consultant, and in the end, what a lot of work, obviously, a lot of paper, a lot of ideas, etc. But in the end, what maybe was the most important thing is that we just issued 12, I would say, bold statements on the future. And we submitted them to an international panel of 120 energy experts, international. 80 of them answered, half of them European, and in those 40, 20 were French, and half of them, 40 of those were non-European. And so we tried to identify trends, and trends that were largely shared by most experts at world level, and not to try to put some scenarios, scenario 1, scenario 2, scenario 3. I think it wasn't what we wanted to do. And so, for instance, what we got was, for instance, one was, those statement was low carbon or even zero carbon power system will be competitive compared to fossil fuel ones at two horizons, which were 2030 and 50. 2050, we get 85% of those experts saying yes. So this was, okay, when I go back to that, when it's published with some interviews, etc., when I go back, when I go in front of my college of commissioners, then this is something to, okay, just is useful to have, I would say. Another one, which in the insight maybe less good, because maybe if we did it again, this first one is obviously we're right. Well, experts were right. Second one is less evident, because you see regarding the energy, the hydrogen economy, there were very, very little positive answer. A lot of people not knowing, but only 27 people thinking that in hydrogen would play a major role in 2050, which is very, very, very low, very, very far away. So hydrogen, maybe those experts were a bit wrong, but anyway, it was very, very interesting to have that. And so based on that, we also obviously highlighted the need to accelerate innovations. We had a lot of internal process that were improved, I would say, and also took 2 years, but we managed to put in the law because in France it has to be put in the law. I don't know why, but that's it. The possibility to create a regulated sandbox in energy, which has been done. So we have also had one window for that, and the second one is now in place. So that was the following of this study. Regarding sandbox, one point we discovered with the practice is that it's a very good thing, but you have to be careful not to overuse it. because it can become kind of an excuse for waiting. And if you want to have some change in the regulation, in the law, I don't know, some people could tend to do, okay, just put it in the regulation box and just go back to us in 3 years when you have your experimentation, the result of experimentation. So you have to be careful regarding those sandbox. It has not to be an excuse for doing nothing. Another one also, we tried to get with another message. We were not successful, saying give more competency, more power to the independent regulator. That was one for the parliament session of the government. And then I would say it's not really a success because I would say 4 years ago, because the result for that was for half 2018. So 4 years later, I would say even our college of commissioners and our president, they weren't very keen on going on that one because it's not easy for a regulator to say, hey, I want more power, more missions. But in France, I think we could do better with that because the government, the parliament, they are still doing too many things in the details and they are not well equipped to do that. Whereas the regulator, I think, would be more fit for that. Fitter, I don't know. So, and we also another. Sorry, we go back. Well, in the also other following very important. In the 12 months following this report, we issued 3 reports, very important ones. One on self-consumption. This one was not so positive. It was just, okay, self-consumption. We have to go for that, but be careful. We also have to continue to finance networks and also continue with taxes. If you just exempt self-consumers, big ones, small ones, from any taxes, then okay, but look at the hole in the public finance. So just was that the kind of message, not a very positive one. It was a kind of mixed message, but this one also had an impact. Second one regarding storage of electricity. So we just show our roadmap, which was a roadmap including what we had to do, what government, parliament had to do, and what network operators had to do. So we then, following this roadmap, we had working groups called by CRE and DGEC, which is the French administration on energy. And well, we have a lot of concrete measures implemented regarding connection, efficient connection for storage, access to markets, etc. So this one was very, very, I would say, useful. And also a third one on electric mobility and power networks, which was 2 years ago. Now we are just following up with a new report, which it's just on a large one on electric mobility and the electric power system, and trying to assess the whole impact on the transportation sector regarding the electric sector, and it's very interesting. I think this kind of thing we wouldn't have done, I would say, 2 years before, without this view on okay, we as a regulator, we have to go other than only doing our day-to-day business. We have to look forward. And so, well, that's my main point. I'm expected. I'm in the time, and then we have this Foresight committee, so which is working. It's the 4th season, and so we have well, the basic thing is just to put together everybody around the same table, working groups, not going for immediate measures, parliament or government, because if you do that, you will run into very difficulties with lobbies, etc. So looking forward, trying to, and this is most important thing, identify trends that are not seen yet by everybody, but that every experts can agree on, that are important trends, and trying to make them public and trying to raise the awareness of government, parliament, etc., on those trends. And obviously, when you talk long-term issues, you also have strategic goals. You also have, obviously, people are have their well, I don't know, in their mind, they have some their own ideas that are there in their that are in the strategic interest, obviously. But the experience is that you can do that, and this is the 4th season. We have frequently 50 people in our working groups. So the fact of gathering people, not working on short-term measures, but working more long-term, that's useful. People like to do that, and people, I think, find interest in that. And we think that this Foresight committee is a success and continue to be a success. And so we're on the 4th season, just been launched now. So we are working on some kind of issues which are kind of complex one, but for instance, biomass, which is very important if you want to replace natural gas, fossil gas. But what is exactly the situation with carbon neutrality with biomass? It's a kind of controversial issue, but we have to just put everybody on the table and try to look at the present and the future. Electrification of uses. We don't know that carbon neutrality that goes with electrification. So how can we go to that long-term speaking? And also, well, consumers, they have to be more and more used to new energy services, but it's very, very difficult because they are just used to just push the button and they have the light. And it's a huge objective to have them change their habits, in fact. So that's it. We have this incredible crisis, this kind of move backwards for, I don't know, kind of decades. For instance, in the energy sector, we will use a lot of coal in Europe, but elsewhere in the world, because if you use less gas, you use a lot of coal. So big move backwards, maybe for years. But in the end, we must look forward, and forward, that's the energy transition. That's carbon neutrality. That's very, very important. So how to manage this move backwards that we are seeing now with this long-term goal, I think it's a huge question for regulators and government, I would say. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dominique, for this very stimulating talk. In the 2 previous talks, we already had this tension between long-term foresight and short-term implementation constraint. It's obvious that in the case of energy nowadays, it's even more straight and challenging. And also, thank you very much for having shared with us this experience of the French electricity regulators of developing its own foresight initiatives in different ways, but especially thanks to this organization of policy, not policy, of dialogue, foresight dialogue with the stakeholders, but also the experts beyond the stakeholders. So that's an important issue. And also to raise the point you rose about the fact that since it has not a direct impact on regulation, it's not just to draft a new regulation, that it might be the case that you are less submitted to lobbying, even of course if lobbyists are also long-termists and of course expect that the contribution of the various stakeholders to this type of dialogue allows to take into consideration their stakes, but this is the role of regulator to understand the stakes facing the various stakeholders. In the UK, they have chosen a kind of, not a different way, but at least they have instituted this Regulatory Horizon Council, which is an independent expert committee that identifies the implication of technological innovation to provide the government with impartial expert advice on the regulatory reform requested. So I think this is very stimulating to benefit from this contribution of Samuel Omolade, who is the head of Regulatory Horizon Council, to explain us how it works and how, in fact, you develop those foresight exercise and how it turns into a recommendation for the various stakeholders and, of course, for the government among the many stakeholders. So the floor is yours, Samuel. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you to the OECD and the Club of Regulators for organising this, and thank you to the attendants on the call. So one of the benefits of being last is I can reflect on some of the presentations that have come beforehand, and some really interesting insights. Some of them which I will touch upon when I go through my presentation. So thank you, Eric, for the introduction. As Eric has said, my name is Sandro Omolade, and I head up the team of civil servants who are supporting the Regulatory Horizons Council. So here we are. I won't repeat what's been said. We were set up in response to a white paper that the government put together, recognizing some of the challenges that's been discussed around the pacing problem and the transnational boundary issue. And it felt like one of the recommendations that came through from that paper was that we ought to have an independent expert committee that provides recommendations to the UK government. So I won't go through who sits on the expert committee, but it's a mix of regulators, academics, and those who work in business or have industrial experiences. So I'll just briefly touch on what our exam question is. Our exam question essentially is, how should the regulatory environment change if the UK is to get best value from technological innovation? So I'll just touch upon the different facets from that exam question. It's when we talk about regulatory environment and consider regulatory change, we talk about that in the broader sense. So examples, when you often have conversations with colleagues in this space, they tend to pivot towards legislation. However, we think about it in a broader sense. We think about standards, we think about rules, guidance. One of the interesting things that comes up time and time again is when people talk about regulatory reform, is that sometimes it's not so much around the substance of the regulation itself, but the perception of how the regulation is being applied. So I think the point there is we're not just looking at the classic legislation, we're looking at the broad sense of regulatory change. And then when we talk about change, that can come in many different forms. We're always thinking about how can we get best value for the UK, and how does regulation help us enable that? So that might be taking a deregulatory approach. That might be the case of introducing new regulation. That might be in the case of convening the right stakeholders to provide a bit more information around the substance and the process. So again, it's coming back to that point around what's the best approach that can unlock value for the UK. And then I'll just end on the final two. The third one is around best value and talking about better outcomes. So naturally, when there's a conversation around best value, sometimes again there is an assumption that that's talking about the economic value, so things like GDP, productivity. But when we think about best value for the UK, we're thinking about the economic, the social, and the environmental. So thinking really broad and really holistic. And then the final thing is around technological innovation, which touches on why we've had this, one of the key reasons why this meeting is set up. And one of the key things we're really thinking about is recognizing that regulators have limited bandwidth. They're always dealing with, they're firefighting on a day-to-day basis. One of our purposes is to actually, the phrase we use is to undertake future back approaches, where we look towards the future, think about some of the new and emerging tech coming up, and then work backwards to say, okay, what are some of the regulatory reform that one might need to put in place to make sure that by the time the future arrives at our doorstep, we are best placed to make the most out of this new technological innovation rather than being reactive. So I'll just move on to our next slide. So this is a snapshot of the work we've done so far. So we tend to take two approaches, one vertical and one cross-cutting. A lot of our work has been vertical so far. So in our tranche one pieces of work, we've produced reports to the UK government, which it's responding to, on recommendations for how the UK can get best value out of genetic technology. Sorry, my slide is jumping all over the place. Genetic technology, fusion energy, drones, and medical devices. So those reports are all on our website. And then in terms of our current piece of work, we're undertaking 3 vertical pieces of work. One, thinking about artificial intelligence as a medical device, hydrogen in maritime, and neurotechnology, which is really exciting. And then the final one is, I think, really interesting because it's our first piece of cross-cutting work. And just to briefly summarize it, our minister, our Secretary of State in the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy has commissioned us to look at this piece of work. And initially, the task was to look at principles for pro-innovation regulation. But in the spirit of being agile, we looked at that commission, we looked at the landscape and recognized that there are many different documents out there that talks about principles. There's the OECD report that Miguel referred to. There's a report within the UK of organizations like Nesta. The World Economic Forum have done some interesting things in this space. So rather than adding another set of principles, what we thought would be best value would be to recognize that there is a consensus on what some of these principles are. So for example, being experimental, being outcomes focused, for example. So our report actually is going to look at, our report is going to be entitled Closing the Gap. Recognizing there are some challenges to unpacking some of this. What's the gap between the rhetoric and implementing some of this in practice? And some of these learnings that we've picked upon, I'll touch upon in my presentation. But we're happy to share this once it's published, ideally next month. So what's the problem we're trying to solve? I won't spend too long on this because my panelists have talked about this and the audience, I presume, are much more familiar in terms of the pacing problem and the convergence problem. I think from a personal observation, even though I know a couple of people have referred to it, I find that a lot more people are familiar with the pacing problem and the rate of innovation exceeding the rate at which regulation can adapt. I find that convergence is as important, but it's talked about less often. And I feel from my perspective, both of them are both critical in addressing this issue around strategic foresight. So the way I've structured my presentation, there are many different ways to approach this, but I've almost put it into 2 buckets. One is around strategic foresight, and then the second is around getting the right tools for the job. Okay, so strategic foresight. So I haven't got my slide up here, but one thing to be aware is our Government Office for Science, which is a cross-government initiative, are developing a web application that's going to be collating emerging tech that's based on commercial data, academic data, and patent data. And that's something that's currently in beta form. And their primary focus is on sharing that with government departments. But I'm really keen that regulators are seen as part of the policy cycle and part of the policy family, because as we've discussed, regulators also need to do some of that foresight thinking. In terms of what the RHC has done itself, we've undertaken horizon scanning to inform some of our priorities that I talked about earlier. The second thing is that we've undertaken a piece of work called 7 Questions Interviews. And this is based on an approach that Shell pioneered, I think it was in the 70s or 80s, where you're meeting with stakeholders and asking them questions that are more future-led. So that's quite an interesting interview technique that we encountered, and we've produced the findings of that on our website. And then in terms of our current work, we're quite keen to infuse futures and foresight into our piece of work. So for example, on neurotech and AI as a medical device, we're currently liaising with our colleagues on features and foresight to design a hackathon where we bring forward scenarios of how new scenarios of how AI as a medical device could look like in the future in 5-10 years, and then undertake what is called backcasting. So working backwards from those scenarios and those futures, identifying what are some of the regulatory implications and what are some of the regulatory things that one may need to put into place now to either achieve that desirable future or to avoid a future that's undesirable. If I move on to the next slide, I think within the bucket of strategic foresight, I think it would be remiss of us not to acknowledge that there are some challenges here. So one of them is the classic bias towards the present. This is not something that just afflicts regulators. This afflicts policymakers, and it's a general human, I suppose, fallacy in terms of the behavioral science. So that's one of the key challenges. The second is around resource. All regulators aren't equal. So for example, in the UK, you will have the Medicines and Human MHRA, who deal with medicines and medicines approval, and they have about 2,000 staff, compared with another regulator called the Gambling Commission, who have about 100 staff. So naturally, those regulators that are bigger and have more capacity have a bit more, potentially in theory anyway, have a bit more capacity to do some of that forward thinking compared to a regulator that's much more smaller. The other challenge is around regulatory silos, which some of my co-panelists have talked about, so I won't spend too long on that. And then the final one is around, I suppose, behavioral challenges. This kind of links into the first point. I think we can't, even though it's so obvious, I think we can't fall into the trap where regulators are seen as a homogeneous group. They are made up of different people with different interests, different mentalities, etc. So it's really important that the tone from the top has got to be attuned to looking forward, because if that's not there, then it will be difficult to get the organization to think about some of that forward-looking challenges. So just thinking about some of the approaches that the R8C, recognizing we are not a regulator, but we almost sit in above regulators to think about best practice. Some of the approaches that we're taking within the UK. When we're, one of the interesting things that when we spoke to regulators is that when we talk to them about horizon scanning, they envisage horizon scanning as speaking to other regulators and government departments. And whilst that's really important for gathering intel, there's also a risk there in the instance that you're speaking to the usual suspects all the time. And then the second risk to that approach is that you're missing out on the academic and grey literature to supplement the intel that you're gathering. So this is where that web application that I talked about earlier could be really important. The second approach is recognizing what I said earlier around regulators and indeed policymakers have different resource. One of the things we're trying to promote is having a scan approach. So rather than developing a horizon scan specific for your own sector, actually recognizing that there are existing horizon scans out there, and it could be more efficient to just amalgamate them and think about some of the themes drawing out from them. And then the final point I'll make is around pooling resources. So for example, one of the initiatives within the UK is the setting up of the Digital Cooperation Regulation Forum, which includes those 4 regulators there. And part of their remit is looking at horizon scanning, looking at futures and a greener work plan. And that's quite an interesting way of making sure that, first of all, horizon scanning doesn't fall off the agenda, but also it means that resources are shared. So choosing the right tool for the job. I'll just focus on a couple of things. There are many things I could focus on. In terms of the challenges, I think the big problem is what I've termed here the Goldilocks problem. I think most of you are familiar with the fairy tale of Goldilocks and the 3 bears, where a bowl of porridge is too hot, too cold, and trying to find the right one. I think, to be realistic, one of the challenges here is, particularly when engaging with new and emerging tech, you want to avoid regulating too early because you don't want to hamper the innovation, but you don't want to fall into that classic trap of waiting until behaviors are set or new products are set that may have harm. So you don't want to regulate too late. So how do you find that right balance? And I suppose one of the ways you can do that is by trying to find the right tools for the job. So the first one I won't spend too long on because people have touched on some of the merits of soft law compared to prescriptive legislation in terms of introducing more faster approaches. It can evolve to reflect the needs and the different spectrums of risk. It can potentially allow for experimentation as well. But going back to the point I think Miguel made, but also Susanna made around soft law, none of this is a golden bullet. There is, well, I think it was Susanna who made the point around the democratic deficit, recognizing that these standards in some cases or best practice are developed by some of the big players. We've got to make sure that it's as inclusive as possible, and recognizing it sits outside of the formal legislative process in terms of engaging with elected representatives who've been elected by the people. So that's one of the things to bear in mind. I think the second point is around there's a risk as well that soft law can turn in, some of the benefits of soft law can be reduced when it turns into a process whereby it's seen as hard law, where it's really difficult to change. It's seen as something in which you have to enforce strictly, because then it starts to detract from the actual benefits of taking the soft law approach. And then the final approach that I wanted to be slightly provocative about, but just to raise, was around doing nothing. So I think most of us are aware that the option of doing nothing is always on the table. But I think the point I want to highlight here is around the option of doing nothing to be taken seriously, particularly within the context of regulating with new and emerging tech. Now, from a behavioral perspective, and recognizing that we are working in political context, it can be really difficult for two reasons to do nothing. First is that if you detect that there may be risk of harm, then there may be political pressure to intervene and to undertake a regulatory intervention. And then the second thing is, I suppose, more intrinsic, in that it's waiting in the face of doing nothing in the face of the possibility that there could be harm goes against potentially the I suppose the intrinsic reason why, for some people anyway, why they think regulators exist. It can be difficult to withhold and to say, actually, we are not going to do anything in this space. And I think one of the difficulties of the doing nothing option being taken seriously is the framing of it. Now, doing nothing literally does not mean actually not doing anything. It means when it's done best, it's actually taking a conscious choice to say, there is something in this space that's bubbling. We don't quite have enough information. There are very weak signals and it's imperfect information. So actually, we're going to take the approach of almost taking a watching brief rather than literally doing nothing, because we're going to learn more about the technology, learn more around how the business models develop, do a bit more analysis on the benefit-harm ratio before we then think about whether a regulatory intervention is needed. So that was just the one point I was just going to end on, and then I will just stop there and have questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samuel. And so we have now some times for general discussion and question to the panelists, if any. So at this point, I didn't get any question in the question box. I remind the audience that you can raise your question in the question box. There is however, one question that was raised at the beginning of the meeting that was asked by Carolina Mariani about the question of intellectual protection when considering future regulation. So, do you have any take on that, Samuel?
I didn't quite catch the question around intellectual property.
Yeah, well, the question about intellectual property was that when you are doing foresight and regulatory foresight, you have to consider the evolution of the technology, and then the question is, what about patented technology? Is it to be considered in any exercise? Does it impact on the consequence for regulation or not at this point?
So just to come in on that, I think it is important. One of the I suppose intel that will underpin the web application that I was describing earlier, that will provide a sense of emerging technology, will be patents. Patents can be a helpful indicator and signal of how things are developing in an emerging tech space. Also, I'm conscious that I think it was Sandro who talked about patents within his presentation, so he might want to come in as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Sandro, any comment on this?
Hi. So we are aware that in Britain, the way to connect fragmented information that is future relevant has been horizon scanning. And indeed, what Samuel provided us was a way to connect this with regulatory policy. So for instance, we had a classic development of horizon scanning in the food policy arena, yeah? And the fact is that many times the regulators in our fields, they deal with activity that is being realized. However, the technologies that will move the sector are sometimes not anticipated. So we many times are with a jet lag when the changes are manifesting themselves, which put us always in the back foot. So horizon scanning and the way in which it can be related with regulation, I think that's a very interesting and stimulating perspective. Inside this framework, we could see that there is room for many sort of data devices. And in fact, Samuel, when we have emergent business models, so for instance, in the environmental area or in the energy field, and we check that the tag circular, as in circular economy, is popping up, and we can check trademarks that actually carry that sort of wordage, and we see that they bridge between, say, telecoms and energy product categories or service classes, because trademarks is intellectual legal right, and we can see how the new business models are integrating many aspects. So this is one way in which sometimes we can see, and I've done this myself, checking big utilities in electrical supply system, and see how their portfolio of technological know-how is evolving. And I've done this myself just to check how the big players, the big oligopolistic players, sometimes they remain the same, in the sense that we can recognize the companies, even if they have changed sometimes their corporate identity, but you know that the structure and the assets and the people are still there, but the know-how portfolio keeps on transforming. So the same companies, sometimes they are actually changing in ways that we can actually anticipate ourselves.
Thank you very much, Sandro, for this explanation. So Annegret Groebel from the Bundesnetzagentur would like to make some comments. So Annegret, the floor is yours.
Yes, thanks a lot. And indeed, we are a little bit behind here. We haven't set up a strategic foresight committee, and I very intensively listened to all the good advice and also to the good way forward. So just want to say a few words because I think sometimes we are probably mixing up some things, and I think we have, let's say, something like where we need to react in a sort of planned way. That is the two transition, the two big trends that we have, and I think it was mentioned by Dominique about the energy transition, which is a challenge for all the energy regulators. And we also have the digital transition, which is a challenge for the digital or telecoms regulators. And I think, by the way, the two have something together. The sectors get more integrated. So I think this is the element of convergence and of getting out of the silos. So I think that is something where we need to be, and we need to become quicker there. With a broader view. So I think here it is important to do the forecast, the strategic forecast, in fact, to shorten our time of reaction. Yeah, so that is, let's say, what the one thing that comes from these more long-term planned transitions, which we want to proactively manage is too much, yeah, because I very much agree with what Susanna said. It's not for us to do the innovations, it is for us, and that is my message, to prepare and to set a framework which supports that the innovations can be made. On the same side, we also, and that was mentioned by Maya and others, of course, we also need to be, let's say, faithful to the fundamental regulatory principles to remain stable and predictable. So my approach to this would be to have a principle-based approach that is based on the best information and in particular also the analysis of this information, based or coupled with the principles that we use also already now, yeah, so that we can try to make sure that our answers and our reactions as regulators come fast and come quickly and are flexible enough or agile enough, but are on the same time based on our fundamental principles, so that there is this kind of trying to make both ends meet, so that we have the fundamental principles, but that we then apply them in a flexible, agile way based on the data analysis and on scenario analysis also, to see that to be able to react quicker by forecasting or by assessing different scenarios or different possibilities to react, because I think this is what we need to do, given the uncertainty. I agree with what Samuel said there, that we need to, how can we overcome this uncertainty? And that is, I think, by trying to compare and to assess different scenarios, and trying even to, if possible, to attach certain, let's say, risk factors to them, so that and then of course match them with a possible reaction by the regulator, and this possible reaction being linked to certain criteria or certain triggers ensures that we remain predictable. Yeah, so that would be the way I would try to overcome this tension that we all are in, to not be discretionary, as Maya said, but on the other side also not to be too strict or to be to start micromanaging a sector, which or innovation, which is impossible. Yeah. So, but combining in a way the best of both possibilities. So that is that would be the way forward. And I think it is also very important to remain on top of things by continuously improving the forecast and the foresight by inputting the new data, the new information that we have in all ways on the reaction of stakeholders, on technological innovations, on behavioral changes, etc., so that we improve the data set, but that we and that is the key element then, that we also always question ourselves on the assumptions, whether the assumptions which we input in this manner still hold. Yeah, and that can then improve the quality of our foresight, and with this shorten the reaction time, and with this then enable us to react in a faster way, and in that way then more agile and more innovation supportive. Yeah. And of course, the very last step then would be that if all these assumptions still hold, we can be sure that our principles are adaptable and can be used in a rather adaptive way to a new situation without changing the fundamental model. However, if our analysis at a certain moment in time comes to the answer that the majority of assumptions does not hold anymore, or is not fit for the purpose of dealing with a completely new situation or disruptive situation, I think then we need to think about whether the regulatory model still holds. But I think we are not yet at that point. So I think we have learned, and this is maybe the final sentence I would like to say, I think we have learned from these short-term, completely unexpected challenges of the pandemic and now of the Russian aggression in Ukraine, how important it is to be prepared and to be also in a way resilient, so that we also try to prepare better for the situations, because I think that is also a lesson that we learned, to be better prepared, more resilient, and then and have, let's say, really go through the different options that we have and adjust quickly in order to be on top of things again, and find ways of dealing with the situation in a fair way without losing out of sight our objectives that are still there, to give the consumers the value for money, to ensure predictability and confidence of investors so that we get the infrastructure we need, and to overall have a well-functioning market as much as possible, because I think that is what we still have. We have a regulation that is embedded or on the basis of well-functioning markets, and these two must go together. So this would be, let's say, my take, and happy to discuss further. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Annegret. Unfortunately, since we are not in Paris, on basis, so there is no coffee break to discuss further at this point. But and I am also sorry for the other panelists who would like maybe to add something, but we are really running out of time. So I propose to give the floor to Martha Baxter, who is policy analyst at the Regulatory Policy Division in the Directorate for Public Governance at the OECD. So Martha, you have the difficult task to conclude and but take your time. We will not be cut off in 1 minute, so you can take your time to make your point. And thank you very much for doing this complex exercise to summarize, discuss, analyze the panel.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, indeed, I have the easy task today. So thank you to all the speakers for sharing their insights with us. Actually, in a previous life at the OECD, I did some work on strategic foresight and in particular scenario planning with countries on their development strategies. So I'm always interested to hear about what people are doing in this space. One of my favorite quotes from the strategic foresight literature is, "There are no facts about the future. Facts are by definition of the past, whereas the future cannot be empirically observed or measured." Now, we know that the pace of change and technological innovation is accelerating and outpacing our governance systems. And we also know that we are not able to predict the future, but that's not the goal of foresight either. It's really about cultivating this mindset that is open and curious and anticipatory and agile, and to help us be more prepared for the future and to shape better decisions. And the best scenarios are designed to help break the habit of assuming that the future will look much like the present. And I think some of the examples that we've heard today were about our assumptions being proved wrong. And so it's clear that there is value in revealing, testing, and resetting deeply held assumptions and intuitions. So in trying to sum up what we have discussed today, I thought I'd touch upon some of the common elements that I heard coming out of today's presentations. The first is this idea that foresight needs to be a sustained practice rather than a one-off exercise. Indeed, the OECD recommendation that Miguel presented at the beginning talks about conducting systematic horizon scanning and scenario analysis. And I think the example of the UK's Regulatory Horizons Council is a really good example of this. And related to this is this idea that foresight process needs to be embedded into wider processes. Susanna talked about Traficom's approach about looking for weak signals coming from management and quality systems, from whistleblower processes. And in turn, obviously, hopefully this should all be looped into decision-making processes so it can create a continuous cycle of learning and adaptation. Second, I wanted to touch upon, and lots of people mentioned this, is the importance of actively engaging with stakeholders from an early stage. Strategic foresight works best when it can tap into the situated knowledge of different stakeholders. And we heard the example, for example, in the French energy sector of Groebel creating this foresight committee, bringing together all the different relevant stakeholders. I also really liked Sandro's example of ANACOM's contact with the F1 industry, who was sort of ahead of the market, and that helps them as a regulator be ready when some of these technologies come in to the mass market, when the mass market catches up. Others, ARCEP, Maya, you mentioned also reaching out to stakeholders through conferences and discussions within the ecosystem. So there's lots of different ways to bring in these stakeholder views. And then obviously people did touch on the point, there is this imbalance between it's different engaging with the industry versus consumers, because they have very different capacities, and that overall there's a need for transparency in all these stakeholder interactions. Third is the issue of coordination and role clarity across different actors and authorities. Again, going back to the recommendation, we advise a coordinated approach, and that really requires role clarity in terms of who does what. As Eric mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, regulators don't necessarily have the mandate to lead in this area, but they will surely have a role within the policy-making process. And that's something that Samuel mentioned too, and that they're conscious about reaching out to regulators as one of the important actors within this, within the process. And we had different approaches here. Different countries are doing things in different ways. So Dominique mentioned that in the French energy sector, actually it was an industry participant, RTE, that was leading on the scenario work. And so the regulators' work there, the initiative was complementary to this. I thought it was also interesting the way Samuel presented the UK Regulatory Horizon Council's work as sort of doing that work in this space, in the knowledge that regulators sometimes don't have the bandwidth to dedicate the resources that are necessary to this. Fourth point is this idea that strategic foresight is a different but a complementary tool alongside data-driven approaches. So many people were talking about how they have many approaches that are more data-driven, and I think it's a nice way to think about how the two can complement each other. And then finally, I think what came across clearly in many cases was that strategic foresight can be very difficult to do. Maya, you described the challenges of doing forward-looking work. I think Sandro even described it as a foresight failure. So related to this, I think we need to consider what it means in terms of the capacity of regulators and other authorities within the regulatory system. So there needs to be a conscious decision to devote resources to strategic foresight. And indeed, foresight is increasingly part of the new suite of skills, I would say, that regulatory agencies and other actors are developing. And in this regard, Samuel mentioned, I think, an important point that not all regulators are the same, and different regulators will have different capacities to do this forward-looking work. I also noted the calls for potential OECD support in this area from panelists, and there was a couple of comments in the chat. So I'm happy to say that in the network of economic regulators, we will be discussing the recommendation, how to implement it, which also obviously covers this work on foresight. So I look forward to those discussions with many of you. I know we are running short on time, so I think I'll wrap up there. But before we close, I'd just like to thank Eric and his team, Marie-Hélène and Sophie, and the OECD team, especially Alex Durand, as well as, of course, all our speakers for making this fascinating discussion possible. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Marta. Of course, I join your thanks to both teams, and also I would like to warmly thank the regulators and the experts that share their vision with us today. What I take personally from this exercise is the importance of those exercises to make sure that both the regulators and the stakeholders are prepared to evolution and potential disruption. That's maybe one of the main goal of those exercises, of those foresight exercises. It is about changing the mindset and about enabling collective thinking about the way to adapt to new situation and to evolving situation, and sometimes to disruptive situation. So thank you very much again, and of course we'll have the occasion to discuss those issues in other contexts, of course in the context of the network of economic regulators meetings from the OECD, but also in many further conferences on agile regulation. So thank you again, and see you hopefully in person in 6 months for our next meeting.